In the heart of Italy, Naples stood as a jewel of Mediterranean civilization, a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, where narrow cobblestone streets echoed with centuries of history. But in October 1943, those same streets would echo with a different sound, the sound of destruction. The Second World War had reached its bloodiest chapter. German forces occupied the city, transforming its ancient piazzas into military strongholds. Allied troops advanced relentlessly through southern Italy, squeezing the German defensive line like a vice closing on its prey. Naples became the breaking point, caught between two massive armies in a struggle that would determine the fate of Europe. Citizens had learned to read the sky. Every dawn brought the question, would today be the day? Mothers held their children closer. Fathers reinforced cellar walls with whatever materials they could scavenge. The elderly remembered the Great War and knew this one would be worse. Much worse. The night of October 4th arrived with deceptive calm. Stars dotted the Mediterranean sky, and for a brief moment, Naples almost felt like the peaceful city it once was. Families gathered for modest dinners. Children whispered stories before sleep. Life insisted on continuing, even as death circled overhead. Then came the sound, a distant rumble that grew into a roar. The air raid sirens screamed too late. Allied bombers filled the sky like a swarm of metal locusts, their engines drowning out the desperate cries below. The strategic objective was clear: destroy German supply lines, cripple their ability to resist. But strategy looks different from 30,000 feet than it does on the ground. The first bombs fell on the harbor. Explosions tore through warehouses and docks, sending flames climbing into the night sky. The second wave targeted railway stations. The third wave hit residential neighborhoods. In war, the line between military targets and civilian homes dissolves in smoke and fire. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds. Churches where generations had been baptized, married and mourned became tombs. Schools where children learned to read transformed into mountains of rubble and twisted metal. The historic center, with its Baroque architecture and Renaissance treasures, burned like kindling. Families trapped in their homes screamed for help that wouldn't come. Others fled into streets filled with falling debris and choking dust. The darkness erupted with orange flames that cast grotesque shadows on crumbling walls. Naples, the city of sun and song, became hell on earth. By morning, silence fell over the ruins. Not the peaceful silence of dawn, but the terrible quiet that follows catastrophe. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires, the smell of burning wood mixed with something worse, something no one wanted to name. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their world erased. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Landmarks that had guided people home for generations existed only in memory now, and everywhere, the desperate search began. Mothers clawed at rubble with bare hands, screaming names. Fathers dug until their fingers bled. Because underneath those mountains of brick and stone, the innocent waited. Children, dozens of them, trapped in collapsed basements, pinned under beams, crying in the darkness for parents who might never answer. The bombing had ended, but for Naples, the true battle for survival had just begun. No one knew if rescue would come in time. Dawn broke over a city that no longer existed. What had been Naples was now a landscape of devastation that defied comprehension. The October sun rose over mountains of rubble where homes had stood, casting long shadows across streets buried under tons of concrete and stone. The scope of destruction revealed itself with cruel clarity in the morning light. Over 2,000 buildings had been reduced to debris. The port, once the beating heart of Mediterranean commerce, lay twisted and burning. Railway lines bent like broken spines. Water mains burst, flooding basements where families had sought shelter, turning refuge into drowning chambers. Survivors wandered through the ruins in a daze, many still in nightclothes, faces blackened with soot and dust. They moved like ghosts through their own city, unable to recognize streets they had walked their entire lives. A grandmother stood before a pile of rubble, insisting this couldn't be her home. A shopkeeper searched for his store, finding only a crater where his family business had operated for 3 generations, but the true horror lay beneath the surface. From deep within the wreckage came sounds that stopped hearts, faint cries, scratching, the muffled calls of children trapped in pockets of air between collapsed floors. Every pile of debris potentially held a life, and every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding them alive. The survivors faced an impossible task. Without proper equipment, without organized rescue teams, without even basic tools, how could they move these mountains of stone? Bare hands bled against sharp concrete, makeshift crowbars bent under the weight. Fathers pulled until their muscles tore. Mothers dug until their fingernails broke away. Progress measured in inches while time raced forward in hours. The enemy now wasn't the German army occupying the outskirts. The enemy was time itself. Children, trapped in collapsed spaces, faced threats that multiplied with each passing hour. Dehydration, injuries that bled unchecked, the crushing weight of debris that could shift at any moment, sealing off air pockets forever. Some cries grew weaker, some stopped altogether. German forces, focused on their own defensive positions, offered no assistance. They had their own priorities, their own survival to ensure as Allied troops closed in from the south. The civilians of Naples were on their own, trapped between retreating occupiers and advancing liberators, forgotten in the chaos of war. Desperate calls for help echoed through the ruins, but who would answer? The city's infrastructure had collapsed along with its buildings. Emergency services were overwhelmed, their own stations destroyed. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, medical supplies exhausted within hours. Fire crews battled blazes they couldn't contain. The machinery of rescue simply didn't exist. Underneath a collapsed apartment building on Via Roma, a group of children huddled together in darkness. They had been playing in a basement when the bombs fell. Now concrete slabs pressed down above them, blocking all light. They could hear voices outside, muffled and distant. They screamed until their throats were raw. They banged on pipes until their small hands bruised. But the rubble was too thick, the debris too heavy. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher. The heat intensified, turning the ruins into an oven. And still the children waited, hope fading with each passing hour. Naples needed a miracle. It needed help from somewhere, anywhere. The city was dying, and its children were dying with it. October 5th, 1943. The sound of engines rolled through the southern outskirts of Naples. Not the engines of bombers this time, but something different, something that carried hope instead of destruction. American troops of the Fifth Army advanced into the devastated city, their mission clear: liberate Naples from German occupation and secure the strategic port for Allied operations. The soldiers expected combat. They expected resistance from retreating German forces. They expected to fight house to house through a contested urban battlefield. What they found instead stopped them in their tracks. Naples wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a graveyard. Sergeant James Crawford of the 82nd Airborne would later write in his journal, "Nothing prepared us for this. Not North Africa, not Sicily. This was something else entirely." His unit moved cautiously through streets that no longer existed, past buildings that had become tombs, through a silence broken only by the crackle of fires still burning. The American soldiers were combat veterans. They had seen death. They had witnessed destruction. But this was different. This wasn't the aftermath of ground combat. This was wholesale obliteration of civilian life. And everywhere they looked, survivors emerged from the ruins, reaching toward them with desperate hands, crying out in Italian words the soldiers didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. "Help us. Save them." The children are still down there. The mission parameters didn't include civilian rescue operations. Command wanted the port secured, supply lines established, defensive positions fortified against potential German counterattacks. But orders written in headquarters didn't account for the reality on the ground, didn't account for the small hand protruding from rubble, didn't account for the crying that came from beneath collapsed walls, didn't account for mothers pointing at debris piles, begging with tears streaming down their faces. Captain Robert Hayes made a decision that would define his career and save dozens of lives. He halted his company's advance. "We're digging," he told his men. "Right now, we're digging." Some soldiers hesitated, uncertain if they should divert from their military objectives. Hayes made it simple. "Those are kids down there. We're getting them out." The Americans brought what the desperate city lacked: organization, equipment, and manpower. They had entrenching tools, ropes, vehicles that could pull away heavy debris. They had medical corpsmen trained to treat injuries. They had rations and water for survivors. Most importantly, they had fresh strength and determination. Lieutenant Marcus Williams organized his platoon into rescue teams. 3 men per site. 1 digs, 1 hauls debris, 1 watches for structural collapse. We rotate every 20 minutes. Nobody works until they drop. The system was efficient, methodical, military in its precision, but the motivation was purely human. Private First Class Daniel Martinez, barely 19 years old, found himself crawling into a gap between collapsed floors, following the sound of crying. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Dust choked his lungs. The concrete above him groaned ominously. He pushed forward anyway, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness until it found a face. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, staring at him with enormous eyes. "It's okay," he said in English she couldn't understand. "I've got you." Word spread through the American units. Soldiers abandoned their advanced positions and converged on the civilian districts. Officers looked the other way as their men diverted from orders. Because in that moment, rank and protocol meant nothing. In that moment, they weren't conquerors or liberators or strategic assets. They were simply human beings who couldn't walk past buried children. The real battle for Naples had begun. The work was brutal. Every pile of rubble presented a deadly puzzle where one wrong move could trigger a cascade of collapse, crushing both rescuer and victim. The American soldiers learned quickly that brute force meant death. Patience meant survival. Corporal Thomas Bennett approached each site like a bomb disposal expert. He would circle the debris, studying the angles of fallen beams, identifying which pieces supported the structure and which could be safely removed. "This one first," he'd say, pointing. "Then we shore up this side. Then we go deeper." His hands, calloused from combat, now bled from concrete and twisted metal. The soldiers worked in the suffocating heat, their uniforms soaked with sweat and dust. Every breath filled their lungs with particles of pulverized brick and plaster. Their backs screamed from hauling rubble. Their shoulders burned from swinging pickaxes against stubborn slabs. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because from beneath the ruins came sounds that drove them forward. A whimper, a cough, sometimes just the faint scratch of small fingers against stone. Private Joseph Romano spoke Italian, the language of his grandparents. He became invaluable, pressing his ear against gaps in the rubble, calling out reassurances to trapped children. "We're here. Hold on." And when small voices answered back, hope surged through the rescue teams like electricity. The techniques were improvised, desperate, sometimes reckless. Sergeant William Foster crawled into a cavity so narrow he had to exhale completely to squeeze through. The ceiling above him was supported by a single cracked beam. One shift, one tremor, and he would be crushed. Behind him, his squad held their breath. Ahead, a child waited. Foster emerged 20 minutes later, covered in dust, with a 7-year-old boy clutched against his chest. The child's legs were broken, his face pale from blood loss, but he was alive. The soldiers erupted in restrained celebration, careful not to cause vibrations that might collapse other sites. Medics rushed forward with plasma and morphine. The boy would survive. But not every story ended in triumph. Sometimes the soldiers dug for hours only to find silence on the other side. Sometimes they found bodies instead of survivors. Those moments hit hardest. Young men who had learned to compartmentalize combat death found themselves weeping over children they had never known. War had taught them to kill. This taught them to grieve. Captain Hayes established a rotation system. No soldier worked a site alone. No one dug for more than 30 minutes without rest. The psychological toll was as dangerous as the physical. He watched his men carefully, pulling aside those whose hands shook too badly, whose eyes had gone distant and hollow. The Italian civilians worked alongside the Americans, mothers and fathers who had already lost everything dug at neighboring sites, refusing to abandon hope while any child remained trapped. Language barriers dissolved. American soldiers and Italian parents communicated through gestures, through shared determination, through the universal language of desperation. By nightfall of the first day, 17 children had been pulled from the ruins alive. 17 families reunited. 17 miracles extracted from hell. But the cries from beneath the rubble continued, and the work was far from over. The rescue operations continued into the second night. Soldiers rigged floodlights powered by generators, casting harsh white light across the devastation. The work took on a surreal quality in the artificial brightness, shadows dancing across broken walls as exhausted men refused to surrender to darkness or fatigue. In these hours, something profound happened. The barrier between soldier and civilian, between American and Italian, between conqueror and conquered, simply dissolved. What remained was purely human, the desperate need to save innocent lives and the equally desperate gratitude of those being saved. Private Daniel Martinez hadn't slept in 36 hours. His uniform was shredded, his hands wrapped in bloodied bandages. Yet when he pulled 8-year-old Lucia Conti from beneath her collapsed home, when she wrapped her arms around his neck and refused to let go, something inside him broke and healed simultaneously. He sat there in the rubble, holding this child who didn't speak his language, and wept openly. The scene repeated itself across Naples. Sergeant Crawford cradled an infant he'd found in a basement pocket, the baby miraculously uninjured, despite being buried for 30 hours. Lieutenant Williams shared his canteen with a group of children pulled from a collapsed school, watching them drink with a tenderness that surprised him. These men, trained for violence, discovered a different kind of strength in gentleness. Corporal Bennett established a makeshift aid station in what remained of a church courtyard. As children were extracted from the ruins, they were brought here for medical treatment. Army medics worked alongside Italian doctors who had survived the bombing. They shared supplies, techniques, determination. A blood transfusion from Private Romano saved a 10-year-old boy with severe internal injuries. The medic who performed the procedure, Technical Sergeant Paul Anderson, stayed by the child's side for 6 hours, monitoring his vitals, whispering encouragements the boy couldn't understand but somehow felt. The rescued children often refused to leave their American rescuers. They clung to these foreign soldiers who had crawled through hell to reach them. Some soldiers carried children on their shoulders as they returned to dig at other sites. Others kept photos that grieving parents pressed into their hands, images of children still missing, still buried, still hoping. Maria Esposito, a mother who had lost her husband in the bombing, watched American soldiers excavate the remains of her building for 14 hours straight. When they finally reached her 2 daughters, alive but barely conscious, she fell to her knees before Captain Hayes. He lifted her up, embarrassed by her gratitude, insisting through an interpreter that he had only done what any decent person would do. But it wasn't true, and everyone knew it. These soldiers had a choice. They could have followed orders, secured their objectives, moved on. Instead, they chose to stay. They chose to dig. They chose to risk their lives not for strategic advantage or military glory, but for children whose names they would never pronounce correctly, in a language they would never speak. Food rations meant for troops were distributed to rescued children. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, crackers, luxuries in a starving city, passed from soldiers, packs to small hands. Coffee from thermoses warmed children pulled from cold darkness. Blankets meant for bedrolls became wrappings for tiny, shivering bodies. The bond being forged wasn't political or strategic. It was elemental, human, and utterly unbreakable. Not every child could be saved. This truth settled over the rescue teams like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The soldiers learned to recognize the silence that meant they had arrived too late. They learned the particular stillness of a body that would never move again. These lessons scarred deeper than any combat wound. Sergeant Foster found a girl of perhaps 5 years old beneath a collapsed wall. She had been dead for hours, maybe days. Dust covered her like a blanket. A doll lay clutched in her small hand. Foster sat beside the body for 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. When his squad mates finally pulled him away, his eyes held a darkness that hadn't been there before. The psychological toll mounted with each failed rescue. Private Martinez stopped sleeping. When exhaustion finally forced him to close his eyes, He heard the crying of children in his dreams. He would wake gasping, certain he had missed someone, certain there was one more voice calling from the rubble that he had somehow overlooked. Lieutenant Williams wrote letters home that he would never send. How do I explain this? How do I tell them what we found here? There's no glory in pulling a dead child from rubble. There's no victory. There's just the weight of knowing we weren't fast enough. The soldiers developed rituals to cope with the trauma. When they found a body, they would stop work at that site. Someone would say a prayer, regardless of whether the child had been Catholic, whether the soldier was religious. It was a moment of acknowledgement, of respect, of shared grief. Then they would cover the small form carefully, mark the location for recovery teams, and move to the next site, because there were always more sites, always more voices calling from darkness. Captain Hayes watched his men fracture under the strain. Bennett developed a tremor in his hands that wouldn't stop. Crawford began talking to himself during digs, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Romano, the Italian speaker, who had comforted so many trapped children, stopped speaking altogether for 2 days after finding 3 siblings dead in each other's arms. The moral calculus of war had prepared these men for many things. They understood killing enemy soldiers. They accepted their own potential death as part of the contract they had signed, but nothing had prepared them for the helplessness of arriving too late. Nothing had prepared them for the guilt of survival, for the burning question that haunted every soldier. Why did I save this child but not that one? At night, when the floodlights finally shut down and exhaustion forced them to rest, the soldiers gathered in small groups. They didn't talk about home or victory or the war's progress. They talked about the children, the ones they had saved and, more often, the ones they hadn't. They shared the burden because it was too heavy for any man to carry alone. Private First Class David Chen kept a notebook where he wrote down the names of every child pulled from the rubble, living or dead. He couldn't explain why, even to himself. Perhaps it was a way to ensure they weren't forgotten. Perhaps it was a way to process the impossible weight of what they had witnessed. The notebook filled with names, each one a story, each one a life that had mattered. The rescue operations continued, but the soldiers were changing. Naples was carving something permanent into their souls, something that would follow them long after the war ended. October 12th, 1943. 7 days after the Americans arrived in Naples, the last German forces withdrew from the city's outskirts. The strategic objective had been achieved. Naples was officially liberated. Allied command declared the operation a success. Supply lines were secured. The port would soon resume operations, feeding the advance north toward Rome. But for the soldiers who had spent a week digging through rubble, liberation felt hollow. They had conquered territory. Yes, but at what cost? The ruins of Naples stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. Over 4,000 civilians dead, thousands more injured, an entire city's infrastructure destroyed. And somewhere beneath the debris that remained, voices had fallen silent that would never be heard again. The final count was written in army reports with bureaucratic precision. 83 children rescued alive by American forces. 83 lives saved through 7 days of relentless digging, of bloodied hands and broken spirits, of soldiers who chose humanity over orders. The number felt simultaneously enormous and insufficient. How many more remained buried? How many had they missed? Captain Hayes stood in what had been Piazza del Plebiscito, now a field of rubble surrounding a miraculously intact church facade. His men were scattered across the square, sitting or lying in exhausted poses, too tired even to celebrate their military victory. They had won the battle for Naples, but the city they had won was broken beyond recognition. The Italian civilians began emerging from shelters and makeshift camps, reclaiming what little remained of their lives. They came to the American soldiers not with resentment for the bombs that had destroyed their city, but with gratitude for the hands that had dug their children free. Women brought what food they had scraped together. Old men offered wine salvaged from collapsed cellars. Children, the ones who had been saved, ran to their rescuers with flowers picked from gardens that somehow still bloomed amid the devastation. Maria Esposito found Sergeant Crawford and pressed a photograph into his hands. It showed her 2 daughters, the ones he had helped rescue, smiling before the war. On the back she had written in careful English, "You gave me back my world, God bless America." Crawford couldn't look at it. He folded the photo carefully and tucked it into his uniform pocket, where it would remain for the rest of his life. Private Martinez encountered young Lucia Conti in the street. She ran to him immediately, threw her arms around his waist, and refused to let go. Her mother explained through tears and an interpreter that Lucia had asked about her American every day, the soldier who had pulled her from darkness. Martinez knelt down, looked into her eyes, and made a promise he would keep. "I'll write to you. After the war, I'll come back." The soldiers of the Fifth Army would move on, north toward Rome, through more battles, more cities, more years of war. But Naples would stay with them. In quiet moments, they would remember the sound of small voices calling from beneath rubble. They would remember the weight of a rescued child in their arms. They would remember both the ones they saved and the ones they couldn't. Decades later, when veterans gathered to share war stories, they rarely spoke of combat victories or tactical brilliance. They spoke of Naples, of a week when the machinery of war paused and humanity asserted itself against the chaos.